here pretty soon. Grayson Grundhoefer joins us, Sic'Em365.com, Bearcast co-host with Craig, and also recruiting coordinator and analyst. Grayson, what a week it was. I know Demetrius Brisbane pretty well, along with Ricky Stewart, because of East Texas, but you could see this probably maybe, or at least on the radar with Khenon Hall, who we had on yesterday. Your thoughts about how quickly this happened?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of those things where when Khenon Hall got hired, it was very clear that both Ricky Stewart and Demetrius Brisbane were going to visit Baylor. I mean, that wasn't really a shock at all. Khenon Hall built some great relationships. And, I mean, you go look at SMU's 2025 class, they had a lot of really, really good prospects committed. And when you have guys like that, but a coach leaves, they're going to go recruit those guys. And I know I got a lot of backlash when Khenon Hall was first hired, just talking about, hey, he's got these relationships. He was the primary or secondary recruiter for these guys. It's something to watch for. And I know a lot of SMU fans were like, oh, I didn't know a secondary recruiter mattered that much. But, guys, I think it's pretty obvious that it does matter and that the relationships he's built have just really, really been impressive. And I think you saw that this weekend. I know I talked to Demetrius before the visit, kind of after Khenon Hall was hired, and he straight up told me, I want to play for him. And so I think that made it pretty apparent from the jump that this was going to be a relationship that could potentially flip him from SMU to Baylor. And obviously it did that. As far as the other guys, Ricky Stewart being another one, right now I would say that's a battle between Baylor and Texas. And that's going to be a really interesting one to follow as well as he decommitted from SMU too. But yeah, getting Brisbane is a great start to this class. I mean, offers from Arkansas, Oregon, Texas, Missouri, Michigan. This is a guy who's just an absolute playmaker, an athlete in every sense of the word. And I know he plays quarterback at Chapel Hill. He runs the ball a ton as well. He's got over 10,000 yards over the past 3 years. I mean, he is a machine out there. And I think he's going to be looked at, I believe, as an athlete prospect. You're going to get him on campus, figure out where he fits the best. But ultimately, I do think he'll probably start out at safety when he does arrive at Baylor, which obviously won't be for a while. So there's still some time to figure that out.
So, Grayson, Demetrius Brisbane, as you mentioned, that was going to be my question of where does he fit in. So what do you feel like was the other, biggest news to know for Baylor fans this week on the recruiting front?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about Junior Day, but I think the biggest piece of news right now is how Baylor could finish the 2024 class. And I know that everyone's kind of moved past that and rushed to judgment on what that class is going to look like, but there was a lot of interesting news this week that I think was really important. So, a couple rankings updates where you look at Joseph Dodds, who's now a 4-star prospect on 3. So a little bit of a jump up there. And then you look at Alex Foster, who still hasn't signed with Baylor yet, but he had a huge jump up on 3. So he's all the way up at a 94 overall prospect, the number 152 prospect in the entire nation, and the number 1 prospect in Mississippi. So he finally got his ranking bump as well, which I mean, that's something that a lot of Baylor fans have been wanting to see. They want to see the national rankings move up, and they did this week for both of those guys. Now, as far as the outlook going forward, going into National Signing Day, the priority right now for Baylor is obviously, making sure that Alex Foster signs. Right now, I continue to feel good about it, and I have felt good about that for a while now. He's obviously the defensive lineman out of St. Joseph, 6'5", 275 pounds. He's been a major priority for the Baylor staff, pretty much since the beginning of this class, since they offered him. And now they're just trying to shore things up and make sure he signs with the Bears and enrolls in the summer. And then the other piece, obviously, is Fort Bend Marshall safety Josh Lair, who was let out of his national letter of intent by Washington when Kalen DeBoer took the job at Alabama. And so now he's kind of been trying to figure out, what's the next stop for him. And Dave Rand and Matthew Palage visited with him on Monday. And then now fast forward to this weekend, and he's going to be at Baylor today and tomorrow. So a great opportunity for the Baylor staff to land a guy who's basically a fringe 4-star, basically an 89, high 3-star, low 4-star type prospect. I think he's definitely a 4-star prospect. I think he would probably be the second best prospect in this class, right behind Alex Foster, if the Bears are able to land him But there's a lot of competition when you look at LSU, potentially Texas, and a couple of others as well. But those are the two main priorities, I think, going into this week. Alex Foster, and then figuring out if they can potentially land a huge commitment from a big-time prospect in Josh Lair.
Anytime there's a coaching change, or in this case, a lot of the staff changed, with Aranda taking over as the title of defensive coordinator and Hall and all the others that are a part of it, you get a surge. You get a little adrenaline rush. And then also you have to be careful about, is it a fake adrenaline rush? Can it be carried over onto the field? How would you describe at least the first, 30 to 50 days of this new staff?
I mean, I think it goes without saying. I mean, they're doing a great job on the recruiting trail, and it's really important. Now, I would also say that, like you mentioned, there's two components to this. You know, recruiting is a big part of this. You got to be able to build up the roster, acquire talent. That's how you build a roster that's set to compete for, this upcoming season, but also for the future, right? When you're building out the program, the way that Dave Aranda and this entire staff are trying to do that. And I would say the staff's done a great job. You know, whether you look at Jake Spavital, Chris Kapolovic, Jared Anderson, and of course, Khenon Hall, a lot of guys on this staff are recruiting at a very high level. Now, the other part of this is, how does that translate on the field? Because at the end of the day, I think anyone on the Baylor staff, I think anyone who covers Baylor would agree that you're only going to be able to sustain high-level recruiting if you actually get it done on the field. And so they're going to have to go into this offseason with that mindset of, hey, you know what? All this recruiting is great, but once the season starts, you kind of got to put that to the side for a second and actually go out there and compete on the field, because last year, obviously, they really struggled. The year before that was also a struggle. I mean, barely making a bowl game, kind of, really ending the season in a rough stretch. And you got to get back to playing really good football on the field. So my expectation is they're going to be a far better football team next year. But in order to sustain this level of recruiting, even with the new staff, you have to be able to win football games and show recruits, that there's a path towards success. Because right now, they believe in that, but you got to put it on the field when it matters during the fall.
Grayson, over on the basketball side of things, you got the Brittany Griner jersey retirement coming up. It's been a little bit of a struggle here for the ladies as of late, though. But with the men, how big was that in your eyes to get that win over UCF the other night and get out of that losing funk that they were in the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I just want to make a comment on the Brittany Griner jersey retirement. That's really cool. And that was someone who, had just an epic career at Baylor, was so dominant. I mean, just watching games back then or just looking at pictures of, her back then, it just is like, man, this is an absolutely dominant player. And so that's really cool. And also to see this relationship be mended, because she's a Baylor legend and you want to make sure that she continues to love Baylor as much as Baylor fans love her. And so I think that's really important and really, really cool to see. Now, as far as the men's basketball side of things, it still has been a tough stretch, but I was really intrigued by the way that they responded against UCF, and especially because UCF came out and just threw some haymakers in that first half. I mean, they were making everything, and it really felt like, okay, here comes Baylor's defensive problems again. Here comes another team that's, shooting the lights out against Baylor, which has been, fairly common this season. But at the end of the day, Baylor responded. And they came out in the second half, played far more physical, played in much better control, and made shots. And at the end of the day, when it all came together, they were really able to pull away in that basketball game and find a way to just, scratch and claw and go on the road and win in the Big 12, which is really, really tough to do. And you look at the conference, it's just so deep. It's just really tough to win games. And to go on the road, beat UCF, a team that's beaten Texas and beaten Kansas this year, it's a big deal, regardless of what you think of this team or what you think of their ceiling. It definitely adds a spark of momentum that they needed, especially going into a game on Saturday where they're playing one of the better teams in the Big 12 in Iowa State. So they needed that win. They got it, and it's a huge one for Scott Drew and the staff to build on.
Grayson, thank you very much. Craig, you got one more to add?
Yeah, just one more question, Grayson. Now I've had a couple of days to think about it further. Anything that popped out to you of particular interest when it came to that schedule release? I know we were able to talk about it on the podcast, but having marinated on it a little bit more, anything else come to mind when you look at that schedule for next year?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about it, but I think that the main thing that really stands out is, getting to play Colorado that first game in Big 12 play is really interesting. I think a lot of teams in the Big 12 would have loved to start with that game just because I think it's going to be nationally televised, especially if both teams come into the game, at least 2-1 or maybe 3-0 going into it. There's just going to be a lot of, I think, momentum and a lot of interest in seeing what that game is about. So I thought that was a really good one. I think playing Oklahoma State for homecoming is another one that I really like. And then, of course, that TCU game, playing them November 2nd, that's great and all. I'm wondering if that becomes something like this is the date that you play TCU every year, because I do think that would be really cool for both programs if there was a date that was locked in that you knew every year, Baylor plays TCU the first weekend in November or something along those lines, just to make it special, because there's really, there's 3 permanent, rivalries in this league, and that's one of them. And so I thought that was interesting as well, something that maybe we'll take note on later in the season. But in general, I think it's a schedule that is pretty favorable for Baylor, even though the teams and, where you're playing isn't ideal. I do think the way the schedule laid out, I don't know that it could have been any better for the Bears going into the 2024 season.
Good stuff. I like the thought that maybe TCU Baylor, like any rivalry, we've discussed some that would be pushed back to the end of the year. Not all of them are. Even BYU and Utah a little bit earlier than normal, but that would be pretty cool. The first Saturday in November, whatever it might be. Thank you, Grayson. Have a great weekend. We'll be in Vegas next week, so I think we're going to maybe get a piece of what you talk about with Alex Foster on Wednesday, National Signing Day. So that's Grayson Grundhoefer with us on 365 Sports.